So just a minute when we get started. This is actually the first Bible study of the fourth year of this Bible study. I realized yesterday. And we're going to be starting the book of Exodus, but let me go ahead and I'll pray before we get started, and then we'll get going. In the Father, the Son, and the Holy Spirit. O Heavenly King, the Comforter, the Spirit of Truth, who art in all places and fillest all things, treasury of good things and giver of life, come and dwell in us, cleanse us from every stain, and save our souls, O gracious Lord. Amen. So when we get started here tonight, I don't have to do a lot of recap because the last Bible study was the introduction to the life of Moses. So it was all introduction. So I'm not going to recap the introduction. That would be kind of pointless. And that's available on YouTube if you want to catch up on it. Lots of stuff about ancient Egypt, about the Torah, and about Exodus and that kind of thing. Tonight, we're going to be getting started in Exodus chapter 1. Technically, Moses isn't born until chapter 2, but the background of chapter 1 is kind of important to how Moses's life is going to unfold and is going to sort of set the stage going forward. So that said, unless anybody has any preliminary questions, which do not include the exact date of the Exodus and those other tedious things that, as I mentioned last time, I am not going to get into because they make my eyes roll back in my head and I pass out when people start arguing about those. We'll go ahead and get started in the book of Exodus, chapter 1, verse 1. Now these are the names of the children of Israel who came to Egypt. Each man in his household came with Jacob. This is, frankly, one of the goofiest language updates. So there are places in Scripture that use the phrase children of God and children of Israel. There are places in Scripture that use the phrase sons of God, sons of Israel. They decided a long time before the current troubles, back in the 70s and 80s, it became unpopular to use like sons of God and sons of Israel because that was considered to be gendered language. And you know that idea is problematic for two main reasons. One of them is it kind of, to me, assumes that women are really dumb and that they can't figure out that sons of Israel or sons of God includes them. Like they're going to get really confused because we used a male signifier. But you know, the bigger problem is that since both of those phrases occur in Scripture, if you translate all of them as children of Israel and children of God, then there's no way to know in English what the underlying verbiage is, what the text actually says, because both of these are being translated the same way as if they said the same thing. Now, in this case, it's especially silly because you notice it says, what it literally says is, now these are the sons of Israel. They've changed that to these are the children of Israel. But as we read the list, it's literally the sons of Jacob. It's the literal sons of Israel. They're all male, right? All the people who are named. And so changing that from sons to children when you're then going to have a list of male names seems to me especially silly. But I much prefer translations that just reflect what the original says and assumes that the people reading it are smart enough, right, to figure out for themselves what's going on. But at any rate, so, and brief old man yells at clouds rant. So verse 2, here's the list of the sons of Israel, each man and his household that came with Jacob, as the text says. Reuben, Simeon, Levi, and Judah, Issachar, Zebulun, and Benjamin, Dan, Naphtali, Gad, and Asher. All those who were the seed of Jacob were 75 persons, for Joseph was in Egypt already. So this is a brief recap, a lot briefer than the ones I usually do at the beginning of these, of where we left off in the book of Genesis. Right. So at the end of the book of Genesis, the last major section of the book of Genesis is really the story of Joseph in Egypt, with some interludes about his brothers. But although he, of course, was sold into slavery in Egypt, he ended up rising through the ranks. And so then when a famine came to Canaan, he was able to bring his father, his brothers, the extended family to Egypt, where he had set up granaries to sort of ride out the famine. And so he was able to sort of save his brothers, despite their ill intent that had been the initial cause of him going to Egypt in the first place. And so this is just sort of reminding us of that. It lists the brothers, the 12 tribes of Israel who we're going to see emerge over the course of Exodus are named for these brothers. We're going to see as we go along that not all the members of those tribes are literally biologically descended from those brothers, but they bear the names of those brothers. And so we get this sort of brief recap, right? All of these folks, they went into Egypt, they went there to escape the famine. And of course, Joseph was already there, which is why they were able to go there to ride it out. Okay, so verse 6, now Joseph died, as well as all his brothers and all that generation. Then the children of Israel increased and multiplied, became numerous, and grew exceedingly mighty, and the land was filled with them. Okay. So that generation dies, right? And some time has passed. Again, we're not going to go into it exactly how long, but centuries have passed. And in that time, rather than after the famine was over, because remember, Joseph had the famine revealed to him by way of him interpreting Pharaoh's dreams. And that's why he knew to build the granaries to ride it out. And that famine only lasted 7 years. But this makes it clear that when the famine ended, the family did not go back to Canaan, but they had remained in Egypt. And while there, they had prospered, and they as a group had grown, right? These households had expanded, generations have passed. There's now a great number of, we could call them Israelites in the sense that they're descended from Jacob, for the most part, right? Because households, of course, are going to include, you know, they've married. There was no, at this time, problem with intermarriage. So Joseph's wife, we were told in Genesis, was the daughter of an Egyptian priest. And we're going to see as we go forward, Aaron's son is going to be married to a woman from Libya. There was not any problem with their marriage. And so we need to get sort of biology and ethnicity out of our heads. right? When we're talking about ancient peoples in general, and even the people of Israel at this point in particular, right? Because we're going to see how Israel comes to be delimited, right? Who's an Israelite and who's not. And it's not going to be ultimately totally based on ethnicity. But that said, these families and these clans and these tribes, they've expanded, right? And they're not just all in one particular place. They're kind of concentrated in a few places. We're going to find out as we go forward in the Nile Delta region, so in Lower Egypt. And remember from last time, Lower Egypt is to the north and Upper Egypt is to the south, because it's based on the flow of the Nile, not based on compass direction. So there's now a lot of them, but also a lot of time has passed since then. Verse 8, but there arose a new king over Egypt who knew not Joseph. Okay. So we need to pause there. Part of not quibbling about the date of the Exodus is the fact that we can't really identify this Pharaoh. And while that's obviously tantalizing and a lot of people get really excited about trying to identify who the Pharaoh of the Exodus was, we don't know. There's no way to know for sure. And more than that, if the Holy Spirit wanted us to know, it would have been really easy to put his name in the text, right? If not originally, at some point in the history of the text, some Israelite who was in the know could have dropped the name in there, but that never happened. And so that's yet another reason why I don't spend a lot of time on that. But this idea here of a new king, right, doesn't just mean like, oh, that particular Pharaoh died who was there, who had given Joseph his high position, and now this is his son or even his grandson, right? As we said, centuries have passed. We're not going to quibble about how many, but centuries have passed. And we've been through at least one, maybe two dynasties, right? Egyptian dynasties by the time we arrive in Exodus. So I think the new king here is pointing to that, right? That there's this political disconnect between the relationship that Joseph and his family established with that Pharaoh, right? Where Pharaoh gave him that high position, right? And so his family was welcomed and were received as guests. And that presumably carried on to the son and grandson and great-grandson of that particular Pharaoh. But now there's been these political disjunctions. So that status, that idea of remembering Joseph isn't just Joseph who, right? It's that that special relationship between Joseph and his people that had existed with that Pharaoh does not exist with this current Pharaoh in this current dynasty. And so he's just looking at them as foreigners. And Egyptians were, to say the least, not fond of foreigners. The word for human in Egyptian in this period is literally, the word for human is literally the word for Egyptian. Right? So there's not a distinction between human being who is an Egyptian and human being who is not an Egyptian. There are Egyptians who are human beings, and then there are foreigners, which are something else. And they were generally seen as somewhat threatening. There were two major periods in Egypt's history, like we talked about last time, where they were invaded and dominated by a foreign force. One of those would be the Hyksos. And the Hyksos were what the Egyptians called Asiatics. That's a weird word that we don't use, Asiatics, but that's the Egyptian way of referring to people from the Middle East, as opposed to from Africa, right? Because they're kind of at the border, right? So people from the Middle East, they called Asiatics. People from Africa, they called other things, a lot of them not polite, because again, if you're not an Egyptian, right? And when they were invaded from the north, when they were invaded across the Mediterranean by mostly Greeks, they called them the Sea Peoples, right? Because that's where they came from. They came off the sea. So Asiatics, or anyone from the Middle East, they would have considered, Joseph and his family would have been considered Asiatics, and their descendants would be considered Asiatics. And the Hyksos, who had come in and dominated Egypt and had to be overthrown by native Egyptians, were Asiatics, right? So there was a great suspicion, distrust of non-Egyptians in general, and people from the rest of the Middle East in particular. Most of the wars that the pharaohs fought, they were fighting on the Middle Eastern front. Right. There were wars of subjugation going south toward the Sudan and Ethiopia, but most of the invasion attempts that were repelled and attacks came from the Middle East, and the Sea Peoples, after their failed attacks, settled in the Middle East. So all that is to sort of frame the suspicion that we're about to read about. We mentioned last time, I think, that the Egyptians, as a matter of hygiene, shaved all the hair off their bodies, right? You've probably seen this depicted in various movies and that kind of thing, and that is a realistic depiction. They did that. They shaved their eyebrows and drew them back on. They shaved their heads and wore wigs. Men shaved their faces and wore those decorative beards, false beards. That was considered a hygiene thing. It was to prevent the spread of lice and other pests. But whenever they depict Asiatics, they depict them with full beards and lots of hair, sort of like these sort of hairy, uncouth, right, barbarians is the idea. So that before there's even any problems, right, before there's the Israelites, before they've done anything, and before the Egyptians have done anything, there's already this kind of distrust and even some contempt from the Egyptian side, and sort of the favors and help that Joseph and his family, the progenitors of these people, had given to Pharaoh has been forgotten. This current Pharaoh and this current dynasty, the Israelites haven't done anything for him, right? And he already has these various cultural reasons to have some things against them. So verse 9, then he said to his nation, look, the race of the children of Israel, or the sons of Israel, is a great multitude and is stronger than we. Come, let us outwit them, lest they multiply, and it happen in the event of war, that they also join our enemies and fight against us, and so escape out of the land. So this is part of that distrust, right? This is part of that distrust. They're looking at them and going, there's an awful lot of them, right? If they just tried to stage some kind of revolution, we could probably beat them because they don't occupy a position of power, but they're more closely related to the quote unquote Asiatics, to these people from the Middle East, from the Near East, with whom we go to war occasionally, right? They're more closely related to them than to us. And so what happens if one of these kings, one of these Hittite kings, or another king who we're about to go into battle with, What if he sends a message to them and we end up getting outflanked, right? While our army is off fighting the enemy, we have this other enemy rise up inside Egypt and, sort of attack us from the back, right? While our back is turned. This could be a disaster, right? This could be a disaster. And then they could go and move on, right? They could go and rejoin their kin, right, over in the Near East, and leave us in ruins. So, and again, this isn't pure paranoia, right? This is actually based on the prejudices and based on the suspicions that the Egyptians held. This is sort of tactical thinking, right, on the Pharaoh's part, right? And his mode of thinking there is something that has persisted all the way to the present day, right? This is why, we can see this just in United States history, right? When the United States went to war with Germany, all German people were suspect. When the United States went to war with Japan, FDR set up the internment camps, right? When 9/11 happened 21 years ago, right? All of a sudden, anyone from the Middle East, even if they weren't Muslim, all of a sudden was viewed with suspicion. It's not right, it's not good, right? But this is Pharaoh's thinking this same way in the ancient world that a lot of modern people still think today, in terms of when they're in a position of making war, they become very suspicious of anyone who might possibly have some reason to have an allegiance with the enemy. And so that's the concern that Pharaoh, right, expresses here about the Israelites. Verse 11, therefore he set taskmasters over them to afflict them in their works. And they built for Pharaoh strong cities, Pithom and Ramses and On, which is Heliopolis. So his solution to this is essentially to put them into work camps, right? His solution is, well, we need to put them to work to serve Egypt, and we'll keep them in a state where they're not going to be able to rise up and rebel. Right? We'll keep them in a state where they're exhausted, they're tired, they're harried, they don't have access to weapons and that kind of thing. And we'll thereby make sure that they can't join with our enemies and rebel. Right? Now, I do have to mention this in passing. Because one of the things people try to do to date the Exodus and figure out which Pharaoh it is they'll point to what we just read, that one of the cities is called Ramses here. In the Hebrew, it's P. Ramses. That's a city in Egypt. That city, we're relatively sure, was built by Ramses III, aka Ramses the Great. And so people will then dust their hands and go, aha, right? This tells us who the Pharaoh of the Exodus is. Now, there's a couple problems with that. The first one is that the Pharaoh who's Pharaoh right now is the father of the Pharaoh who's going to be Pharaoh when the Exodus happens. So that part doesn't work out. But the other piece is that P. Ramses was not built by Ramses the Great from scratch. There was already a city there. He just built it up, right? Did a bunch of public works there and renamed it, right? So it's entirely possible that this is referring to the city that later became P. Ramses, but the later name is being used here. Because throughout the Torah, not just in Exodus, but throughout the Torah, back in Genesis, it's very frequent to see updated place names, because the people who were reading this later didn't always know the old name of a city. I'll give an example from Genesis that we saw when we were doing the life of Abraham. When Lot and his family were taken captive from the city of Sodom, and Abraham had to round up his 318 fighting men to go and rescue him, it says that he pursued the five kings as far as Dan, right? The city of Dan. Here's the thing, the city of Dan was named after Abraham's great-grandson, Dan. So obviously it was not called Dan at the time that Abraham did that, right? It was actually called Laish, we know, at that time. But the people who were reading Genesis centuries and centuries later, the first readers of Genesis centuries later, wouldn't know what Laish was. They knew that city as Dan. And so the name was updated in the text to Dan, the new name of the same city. So that may have happened here. And you may notice that right here in the same verse, it says On, which is Heliopolis, right? So there's actually an update right there in the same verse, right? So essentially that doesn't prove anything. And yes, even though I don't really want to talk about the dating, there are going to be a few places here where I have to at least mention it. So I'm mentioning it here. In this case with Ramses, that the fact that that city was eventually named after himself by Ramses III does not mean that that's who this Pharaoh was. There's a lot of other variables. But the idea is that there are these civic construction projects going on. That's what they're enslaved to do. Let me also make clear, because this is this pernicious thing that people have in their heads. The Israelites did not build any pyramids. Neither did aliens, but the Israelites also did not build any pyramids. Okay. The pyramids had already been there. And again, without getting into the dating, the Great Pyramid of Giza, so not the first pyramids, but the Great Pyramid of Giza was at least 1,000 years old by the first chapter of Exodus. At least 1,000 years old, depending on when you date it, right? And of course, the more primitive, smaller pyramids, the step pyramids, all those things go back centuries and centuries before that. Okay. So the pyramids were all already there and were already ancient by the time this is happening. Israelites are not building any pyramids. They're building public buildings, which included temples and stuff in these cities, expanding these cities in the Nile Delta region. That's what they're being put to work on. Verse 12, but the more they humbled them, the more they multiplied and grew. And the Egyptians greatly abhorred the children of Israel. Right. So the Pharaoh had the idea that if we subject them to these harsh conditions, not only will that prevent them from rising up, but to be blunt, the birth rate will go down, the infant mortality rate will go up. These harsh conditions will sort of also act as population control for the Israelites, right? But despite the harsh conditions, the Israelites continue to multiply. Part of what's going on here and why that's so important here as a theme, right? Like the fact that they're growing numerically, right? This isn't like the way we talk about our churches. Like, is your church growing numerically? Yeah. How many members do you have? Right? It's not a measure of success or something directly. But the word that was actually used several verses ago when it was first discussed that they had multiplied and filled the land those verbs in the Hebrew that are translated multiplied and filled are words taken from the beginning of Genesis. So that multiplied is the verb that's used to describe when God creates, like, the birds of the air and the fish of the sea, and they're sort of teeming with life, right? It's the same verb here. And so, and the fill, them filling the land, is the same verb as in the fill the earth and subdue it, that's commanded to Adam and Eve. So the idea here is that even though they're in Egypt and not in Canaan, right, which was the land promised to Abraham, the land that they're going to end up, Moses is going to end up leading them to, God is still with them. And who is their God? We'll get into this more when we get to the story of the burning bush, and Moses has this conversation and this interaction about the name Yahweh. But the name Yahweh, as I've said in this Bible study and other places before, literally means he who causes to be, right? So it's a reference to God as creator. So the mark that the God who created the universe is still with these people, even though they're slaves, is that sort of creative function, right, of bringing forth life, being teeming with life, and filling the land, right? The word for land and earth are the same in Hebrew. Filling the earth, right? That's still happening despite the oppression, despite the slavery, despite Pharaoh's best efforts, right? So we see God here is the one who brings forth life, and we're going to see Pharaoh emerge as more and more, as we continue now, as a force opposed to life. Verse 13, so the Egyptians tyrannized the children of Israel by force. They made their lives bitter with hard labor, in mortar, in brick, and in all manner of service in the field. All their labor in which they made them serve was by violence. Okay. So rather than rethinking his original plan, Pharaoh and his leadership say, well, clearly we haven't made their lives bad enough, right? We need to make their lives and the conditions they're working under even more terrible. That will then lower the birth rate. That will then get them under our control, under our thumb, and we won't have to fear them, right? We won't be plagued by this sort of fear of the other that is sort of built into Egyptian culture at this point. And they do that by means, again, right, that's the repeated reference to violence, to bloodshed, right, by force. All of these things which are opposed to life and the flourishing of life, right, which is what we've seen over the course of Genesis is what God is about, including under Joseph, through him being warned of the famine and setting up the granaries, including protecting and preserving the lives of the Egyptians, right? Okay. Verse 15, then the king of the Egyptians spoke to the Hebrew midwives, of whom the name of one was Shiphrah and the name of the other Puah. And he said, when you do the duties of a midwife for the Hebrew women, and see they are about to give birth, if it is a male, then you shall kill him, but if a female, let her live. Okay. So he now decides to take more direct action, even more direct action in terms of trying to control the population of the Israelites. So this translation in the Orthodox Study Bible, that's what I'm reading from, veils what's going on here even more than most English translations, because it just says, as you do the duties of a midwife and see that they are about to give birth. Those are pretty vague, right? So the Hebrew here, part of the reason why it's vague is that the Hebrew here has something kind of weird. In most translations that go directly from the Hebrew, it says that he told the midwives that when they saw the woman sitting on, and the English translation will say sitting on the birthing stool. The birthing stool. So that kind of might fire the imagination that they have some kind of stool that women sat on. Like, wouldn't they be laying down? Wouldn't that be more normal, right? Some kind of stool on which the baby is born. But if you go to the actual Hebrew word and you look at all of its other uses in the Old Testament, right? So we're not even going to other languages for this. This is just every other place where that word is used in the Old Testament. The word there that a lot of English translations translate as birthing stool actually is the word for a pottery wheel. Right now, obviously they weren't motorized, right? In the ancient world, they were manual, right? You were spinning manually spinning a wooden wheel, right? But they were great producers of pottery in the ancient world, right? So they had a means to do this. So what's happening is that starting with the King James Version, when they're translating from the Hebrew, they're trying to figure out what this means, right? Because they're looking at it and going, when you see them on the pottery wheel, right? Like, so they're trying, did they give birth on pottery wheels? So they came to the idea, well, maybe this is a reference to some kind of stool that looks like a pottery wheel. Right, like some kind of thing, right? Like a pottery wheel, it's round piece of wood, like a stool, like the top of a stool. So they're kind of doing the best they could in English, but that's actually a reference to something Egyptian, right? That's actually a very Egyptian phrase. Or this is Pharaoh talking, right? So if you look at Egyptian depictions of their god Khnum, Khnum is not one of the real popular ones, right? Who we see, right? Like, I don't even think he's in Gods of Egypt, right? That weird movie where they turned like Egyptian gods into silver hawks. I don't know if anybody watched that except me. I watched it for free. So Khnum you may have seen him though. He was the god who had a ram's head. So he has the big ram's horns. He has a ram's head and a human body. But the way Khnum is depicted is sitting at a pottery wheel and forming something. And in the Egyptian stories, Khnum fashioned the bodies of new humans from clay. Right. So when he's sitting there at the pottery wheel, what he's supposed to be doing is forming new humans who are about to be born. Right. So that's the idea. So when Pharaoh says, when you see them on the pottery wheel, right, and what that means is when you're doing your prenatal care as a midwife, right, and you see they're at this point where the child has reached this certain level of development, you need to check to see if it is a male child or a female child, right? So how would they do that, you might wonder? I'm not going to go into graphic detail, and I'm not even going to say that their method for doing this actually worked. Okay? But the Egyptians did have a method involving herbs, I'll just say that they believed would indicate, once the pregnancy was at a certain point, whether the child was male or female. And again, I'm not vouching that it worked. I'm just saying they believed it did. And you could see, even if it didn't work, you could see how they would think it worked, because you basically got a 50-50 shot every time, right? And if you've already set up that it only works at a certain point of development, anytime it didn't work, you could just say you did it too early or something, right? So you could see how that would. But the idea here is that Pharaoh is saying, determine if it's a male or female child once it reaches that point. And then if it's male, kill it. Why would he only want to kill male children, right? And this is, for the record, this is then abortion, right? There have been lots of ways to perform abortions throughout history, right? This isn't just a new thing with medical technology. This has gone on for a very long time. So he's saying if you determine that it's a male child, abort it. If it's a female child, you can let it live. Why wouldn't he just say abort all of them? Why wouldn't he just say sabotage every pregnancy? Well, from his perspective, right, in the ancient world, again, they're not thinking genetics. They're not thinking ethnicity, right? So a male child is going to carry on his family name and his family identity. Right. So if all of the male Israelites, if a generation of male Israelites is removed, right, then the female Israelites are going to have to marry Egyptians and other people living in Egypt. And when they do that, they will join those other families. And so they won't be Israelites anymore. So this is a type of sort of ethnic cleansing or cultural genocide, right? He's going to wipe out the Israelites. And to do that, based on the social structures at the time, all he really needs to do is get rid of all the males, right? And then the females could just sort of be assimilated into the rest of the population, right? And so another thing that this shows is, because the kind of work he was having them do in working with brick and mortar and stone to build city projects, these are things men do, right? I'm sure the Israelite women were put to work too doing other things, but the Egyptians would not have used female slaves for those particular tasks, right? Because just men tend to have higher upper body strength, right? And so what this also reveals, if he was willing to kill all of the male Israelites, that shows that he wasn't having them do this hard labor because he needed laborers, right? He was specifically doing it as a means of population control. He was specifically doing it as a means of oppressing this particular population within Egypt. So verse 17, but the midwives feared God and did not do as the king of Egypt commanded them, but saved the male children alive. Right? So the midwives, remember he said he went to the Hebrew midwives, right? He went to the midwives from that people. There weren't sort of Egyptian midwives going and serving the needs of the pregnant slave population, right, out of charity or something, right? These were other Israelite women, right, who were skilled as midwives helping their fellow Israelite women. And so those Israelite women are like, no, we're not gonna perform, right, these abortions. We're just not gonna do it. And so they're either not doing the test or not caring about the results, right? And letting the children live. Verse 18, so the king of Egypt called for the midwives and said to them, why have you done this thing and saved the male children alive? So Pharaoh, right, calls them back and says, when it becomes apparent to him that they're not following his instructions, he's getting reports of a lot of male babies. He calls them in and says, why did you? And the way it's phrased is accusatory, right? This is how warped he's become already, that, you know, why have you done this horrible thing by not killing these unborn children? Right? That's literally what he's asking. Thus the midwives said to Pharaoh, because the Hebrew women are not like the women of Egypt, for they are lively and give birth before the midwives come to them. Okay, so lively is an interesting translation there. There's lots of euphemisms in this chapter. The idea here is that they're sort of hardy, sturdy women. And so what the midwives are saying is, like, they're not asking us for help, right? We're not doing like prenatal care. These Israeli women are kind of tough and sturdy, and so they don't call for us. They just, you know, they realize they're pregnant, they're fine, they're pregnant for 9 months, they give birth, they never even call us. So see, we couldn't do the test, we couldn't do anything because, you know, they're not calling us, and these babies just appear, and they're not using the midwives, right? That's their counter argument. Verse 20, therefore God dealt well with the midwives, and the people multiplied and grew very mighty, right? So even with the extra violence and oppression, even with Pharaoh trying to coerce the midwives, right, into killing these children, the population of Israelites continues to rise. So it was, because the midwives feared God, he provided households for them. So this is saying that they sort of received a reward from God in having their own children, right? Because they protected the children of others, God blessed them with children of their own in their own households. So Pharaoh commanded all his people, saying, every male born to the Hebrews you shall cast into the river, but every female you shall save alive. Right? So Pharaoh seems to either believe the midwives' excuse or just decide that more direct action is needed either way, even if he doesn't buy it. So he gives the command out, not just to midwives, but to all of the Egyptians, right? If you see a male Israelite baby, you throw it in the river. That's literally what it says. So you drown it, you kill it. Right. So he has just put out the warrant, right, that any male Israelite baby spotted in public is to be killed by the nearest Egyptian, right, who sees it and becomes aware of it. And given, as we said, the cultural disdain, the cultural distrust, the cultural hatred of the Egyptians toward the Israelites, we can expect that this command was probably followed to a great extent, right? It seems very horrific to us, right? Even people in our modern society who have decided to fully accept the idea of abortion generally draw the line at sort of open infanticide, right? They generally draw the line at that, but ancient cultures did not. And that's hard for us to wrap our heads around, right? But not only did these ancient cultures, including the ancient Greeks, all the way through the ancient Romans, not only did they perform abortions, but they frequently exposed infants, meaning they just took them out somewhere and abandoned them in the woods to die. That was a common practice. Plato at one point defends the practice. He says it's good. He says any society that doesn't do that is going to end up with a bunch of people who are mentally and or physically disabled and deformed, and therefore it's better just to go exclusively. This is the mindset of the ancient world, right? So we find that whole idea completely horrific today, but the reason we find it completely horrific is that our society has been Christianized for a couple thousand years, And that's so involves, even if we're not Christians, even your local atheist, right, is so informed by those Christian values that infanticide is right off the table, right? But it was not off the table for ancient Egyptians. It was not off the table for ancient Greeks and Romans. It was, later on in the Old Testament, there are cultures like the Phoenicians who are sacrificing their infants to pagan gods, right? Who we know are demons, right? Like literally. So, yeah, even though it kind of defies, our understanding how someone could do that, the Egyptians would have taken this command, and not only would they have been willing to do it, they would have justified it and seen it as the right thing to do from their perspective, right? Because they didn't consider the Israelites to be really human. They considered them to be animals. And if you have animals that are potentially a threat, potentially predatory, could potentially harm you and your family, then their point of view is, well, you got to get rid of that animal. You got to put it down. You got to do whatever you have to do to make sure that your family is safe from, quote unquote, those animals. That's how the Egyptians are thinking about the Israelites. Okay? And so that's the level that this is now escalated to, right? And again, the crime that the Israelites have committed, the crime that these people have committed against Egypt, is having children and living their lives in Egypt, right? That's the crime that they've committed. That's why Pharaoh thinks they need to be destroyed. So we're going to get started here a little bit in chapter 2. We're not going to get very far in chapter 2, but we'll do a little bit here. So chapter 2, verse 1. Now a man of the house of Levi went and took his wife, a daughter of Levi. So the woman conceived and bore a son, and seeing he was a beautiful child, they hid him for 3 months. Okay. So this child, spoilers, is Moses, and both of his parents are Levites. Don't rush ahead though, right? Because as soon as I said Levites, you may have started thinking priests, priesthood, right? The Levites don't have the priesthood yet. That's something we're going to read about probably a few months from now, right? We'll read about how the Levites become the priests, right? Right now, they're just one of the tribes, and there isn't a priesthood per se in Israel right now. Among the Israelites, we see the same thing we saw with Abraham, Isaac, Jacob, Esau, Ishmael, the 12 sons of Jacob, right? Everybody else, Job, who's a descendant of Esau, where the father, the head of the family, is the one who exercises priesthood for the family. He's the one who's going and offering the sacrifices. He's the one who's praying and interceding for his family. There's not a separate priesthood. It's just the figure of the father as head of the household. That is the priesthood. That is the one who is the priest, right? So he is a Levite, and the fact that Moses is a Levite will be important later, but that doesn't make him a priest per se yet. Don't jump ahead. Also, that translation, seeing he's a beautiful child, that doesn't mean like if he was ugly, they would have let him be killed. That's not what it's getting at. The idea there of beautiful, this is the Hebrew word tov, which can mean good, beautiful, whole. So the idea is more here that he's like a healthy, strong child, right? And why is that at all relevant? Well, this is an era where the infant mortality rate is astronomical. It's higher than 50%. Less than half of the children born, even aside from Egyptians coming and murdering them, less than half of the children who were born survived to adulthood. So the idea here is that he's born and they see, look, he's healthy, he's whole, this is a baby with a good shot. We need to make sure that the Egyptians, extra sure that the Egyptians don't get a hold of him, right? That he isn't harmed by the Egyptians. And so they hide him away for 3 months to keep him safe. Verse 3, but when she could no longer hide him, she took an ark of bulrushes, daubed it with asphalt, put the child in it, and laid it in the reeds by the river's bank. Now his sister was watching from a distance to learn what would be done with him. Okay. So we aren't given the names yet. And I'll talk more about people's names when we get to the names. This is Miriam, his sister, whose name was actually Miriamne in full. And again, we'll talk more about that name later on once it actually occurs in the text. But so for 3 months, they successfully hide Moses as an infant. But if you've ever been around infants, they tend to make noise. They tend to start crawling around, creating disturbances. They become more and more difficult to hide, right, shall we say. And so he gets to this point at 3 months old where she's scared that he's going to be discovered and harmed. And so she makes, and the use of the word ark here is very deliberate. The asphalt reference is actually a reference to tar. And it's picking up language from the story of Noah. The ark language is from the story of Noah. The daubing it with asphalt, the smearing it with tar, right, to sort of seal it against water on the bottom. All of this is picked up from the story of Noah. And so what's being presented here? Well, if you go back to Genesis chapter 5, so usually when people go and read the story of Noah and the flood, they start with chapter 6, right? But the end of chapter 5 actually has Noah's genealogy. Even though, people love genealogies, for some reason they skip that one and start in chapter 6. And in that genealogy, when Noah is born, his father, Lamech, not the same Lamech as the one descended from Cain, gives this prophecy about Noah that God is going to save the world through Noah. Right? We tend to read the story of the flood as this story of God's wrath and God punishing people for their sins. But if we read Genesis 5 and that prophecy, and we let that condition how we read the story is actually how God saved the world from our sin. God saved his creation from us through Noah. Right? And so by picking up this same imagery with Moses now, even though he's in the Nile River, which may or may not have been flooded at the time, right? We're supposed to carry over this idea that we had from Noah, right? So this is sort of a prophetic action, even though we don't get prophetic words here. This is prophetic action. And so the idea here is that just like through Noah, right, God saved the world, through Moses now, God is going to save his people. That's what's communicated here. So you will also see, and I need to comment on this briefly because you'll see it places. You will see folks claiming that this part of Moses' early story is stolen or plagiarized or whatever verb they use from the traditional story of the life of Sargon the First, the Akkadian emperor, who at one point as an infant was sent down a river in a small boat, right? So I'm not denying that there's any connection there. But I think what that fails to do is take the flood into account. And I don't think that's just in terms of the Bible. I mean, it seems to me kind of obvious that since the Torah circulated as a unit, right, Genesis is very much the prologue to what we're now reading in Exodus, right? These didn't circulate separately. It's not like people had Exodus and then someone came out with the prequel Genesis later on, right? Like these circulated together. And we've already seen how that language of creation got used to talk about the multiplying of the people of Israel, right? So already in the text where we are, they've been drawing on this imagery from Genesis, first creation, now Noah and the flood, right? That seems to be a gimme, but that also fails to take into account the way in which the Sargon story was influenced by flood stories that we have preserved in Akkadian, right? And all of the connections that were being made there, right? So why would otherwise reputable scholars, right, make this seemingly obvious mistake on both counts, right? Not seeing this connection between Genesis and Exodus in the Bible, and not seeing the connection between Sargon and earlier stories in Mesopotamia. The reason is simple. It's that there is this idea out there that if we can find something in a non-biblical story that is earlier than the biblical story, that somehow debunks the biblical story or proves it isn't true. There's a bunch of weird assumptions there, right? So, like, one weird assumption is, why would the fact that every culture in the world has a flood story mean that the one in the Bible is not true? Seems much more natural to conclude, well, since every culture of the world has a flood story, including the Bible, maybe this is referring to at least something that actually happened, right? Even if you want to say it was just a local flood somewhere, it would seem to be evidence that it's pointing to something, right? That it's not completely made up. Like every culture in the world just happens to have made up a very similar story, right? That seems far less likely to me. But also, because people have that in their mind, they will take the most ridiculous stories in the world and try to act like they're parallel, right? And sometimes they'll just straight make things up. So you see a lot of this around Christmas, around Nativity, around December 25th, where you have these people who try to connect like Christ to Mithras, and they'll give these lists of similarities. They'll post them in memes online, right? So like Mithras also had a virgin birth, and Mithras had 12 disciples. I mean, a lot of those things are just completely citation needed, like literally no one knows where they came from originally. And feel free to ask anyone who posts those things for citations, because they don't have any. There's no primary source documentation for like 90% of that. And the other 10% is usually taking two stories that are completely unrelated and trying to make them the same. So I'll give an example of that, and I'll have to do this a little bit euphemistically because of the nature of one of the stories, right? So you will sometimes see they'll give a list of, oh, here's other figures, like in Greek and Roman mythology, who had a quote-unquote virgin birth. And one of them that's almost always on the list is Adonis. So as euphemistically as I can, here is the story of Adonis's birth. Zeus was in a particular place, I'll try not to be graphic, and spilled his seed on the ground. From that spot where he did that, a tree grew. One day, a woman was sitting under the tree. A piece of fruit from the tree fell in her lap. She became pregnant and gave birth to Adonis. So what these folks want us to do is they want us to look at that story and look at Luke chapter 2 and say, oh yeah, I mean, that's like identical, like clearly. Same thing. right? Well, they're obviously not, right? So beware of that. Right? When someone says, hey, here's something outside the Bible in the ancient world that's similar to something in the Bible, that's worth looking at. But if their conclusion is, therefore the biblical story is plagiarized or isn't true or is false or da-da-da, that's when your antenna should go up and be like, well, wait, really? Like, how similar are these stories? How, right? And we need to have a little more in-depth discussion, right? So at the very least, right, what we have here is very clearly these references back to the flood and to Noah. And as Moses, in this sort of basket boat, drifts down the Nile, his sister sort of follows on the bank, sort of see what happens. And of course, his sister is safe because she's female child, right? She doesn't have to worry. Okay. Then the daughter of Pharaoh came down to bathe at the river, and her maidens walked along the riverside. And seeing the ark among the reeds, she sent a maid to get it, right? So she's going out to bathe in the Nile. They did everything in the Nile, right? That's their, source of water in Egypt. Egypt is mostly desert other than the Nile and its floodplain. And so she spots the ark sort of in the reeds near the bank. It got caught and stopped. And so she sends one of her servants over to it. So when she opened the ark, she saw the child crying, and the daughter of Pharaoh had compassion on him and said, this is one of the Hebrews' children. Right? So she opens it up. She sees the child. She concludes, right, this is one of the Hebrew children. They were trying to save him from being killed, right? And she has compassion. So she at least has some kind of conscience, right? The daughter of Pharaoh, and isn't going to harm the child. Verse 7, then his sister said to Pharaoh's daughter, shall I go and call a nurse for you from the Hebrew women, that she may nurse the child for you? Right? So the intent here is already sort of expressed that Pharaoh's daughter is, because she has compassion, is going to adopt this child, right? But she, not having been pregnant herself, is not ready to breastfeed the baby. And so Miriam says, hey, should I go get you a Hebrew woman to come and be a wet nurse, to come and nurse the child for you, right? So Pharaoh's daughter said to her, go. Then the maiden went and called the child's mother. So she goes and gets her mom, right, Moses's mother, to come and nurse Moses as a wet nurse for Pharaoh's daughter. Pharaoh's daughter then said to her, take this child and nurse him for me, and I will pay you. So the woman took the child and nursed him, right? So we now have Moses growing up with his own mother, but under the protection of Pharaoh's daughter, considered the child of Pharaoh's daughter. Verse 10, now when the boy was grown, she brought him to Pharaoh's daughter, and he became her son. And she called his name Moses, saying, because I drew him out of the water. Okay. Now, this is where we'll end, but this is an interesting thing, right? Because because I drew him out of the water is actually an incorrect etymology of the name Moses. So Moshe in Hebrew, the kind of closest thing in Hebrew to that is the verb to draw, like to draw water. And so there's a wordplay there in the Hebrew to explain Moses's name, right? But logically, if he's being named by Pharaoh's daughter, right, then she's not giving him a Hebrew name. right? Because she's presenting him to her father and everyone else, the people who are killing the boys, as her own son. So it would make sense for her to give an Egyptian name, and Moses happens to be an Egyptian name. You may have noticed, for example, there is a Pharaoh named Thutmose, right? Ramses actually contains the name Moses, right? The Mz's, in how we pronounce it, is, if you look at the consonants, it's the same consonants as Moses, right? And what the name Moses means in Egyptian is also contained in this verse, even though it's a little more subtle, because here they changed child to son, which is the exact opposite of what they did in chapter 1, because translations, they're inconsistent about things, right? So took her as her child, right? And the name Moses in Egyptian means child, right? Means child. So this contains both a Hebrew etymology and an Egyptian etymology for Moses's name. The Egyptian etymology would have been what Pharaoh's daughter was intending, but the Hebrew etymology, right, is related to what Moses' actual mother did in saving him through the water, right, and maintains this other connection. So there's a little bit of a play happening here between the two languages. So yeah, Moses, like Thutmose, the Pharaoh Thutmose, that name means child of Thoth, the Egyptian god Thoth. Ramses means child of Re, the Egyptian sun god, or Ra, if you aren't putting on airs like I do. So yeah, whenever you have that Moses ending, right, that means child. So if there's a prefix on it, it's child of whoever that initial name is, right? And that's what the name means. So his name just means child to the Egyptians, but it means like drawn out of the water is the idea. Drawn up out of the water if you're a Hebrew, right? That sort of means of salvation. And there's going to be more salvation through water coming up in this story, as probably everybody knows without me having to give spoilers. So that's where we'll end for tonight. We have a little bit of time left if people have any questions. I don't see any in the chat yet, but if you have questions, you can type them in the chat, or you can just sort of unmute in an orderly fashion and ask them.
Question. Did they know it was a Hebrew baby because Moses had a full beard and super hairy when she opened the basket?
Not at 3 months old, no.
So I just thought.
He probably was hairier than an Egyptian baby would have been. So trying to decide how to put this delicately. We're going to find out later that Moses wasn't circumcised. And the Egyptians practiced circumcision, but they did it differently. This is the part I'm trying to figure out how to put apart delicately. They did it differently than the Israelites did. So as delicately as I can put this, the Israelites cut around, right? And the Egyptians cut like a line across. And that was done in infancy. So the fact that he was 3 months old and didn't have an Egyptian circumcision is what would have marked him out as non-Egyptian to her. Does that make sense without me having to get graphic? That's
Yes, it does.
okay. That's
Say, Father, this is Bart.
yes.
The pharaohs saw themselves as like a divine person. Did the Egyptian people see themselves as like descendants of the gods or some superior race because of their connection with a god or something?
So yeah, there was a belief that the Pharaoh was a god. Different gods in different eras of Egyptian history. So by this time, in this period, and again, I'm not going to go into the dating, but around this period, it would have been Horus, who was sort of the eldest son of Re at this point. They saw the Pharaoh as sort of a living image of Horus, right? So sort of his person they saw as being like an idol in a temple of Horus. In terms of the average people, so they didn't believe themselves to be divine in that sense. Now, as I said, they believed themselves to be human and sort of other humans to be like we would look at, apes or something, right? We would look at some kind of highly advanced animal, but still an animal and not a human, right? They would have drawn that line not between humans and animals, but between Egyptians and everyone else, right? Now they did. So part of the Egyptian understanding was that they were, like most ancient peoples, very into astrology. And so they saw what they saw in the heavens, they saw to be a direct reflection related to what was below, right, on Earth. And so, for example, the sun in the sky is one of the bodies of Re, the sun god. He has a bunch of them, right? They're in different temples, they're in different places, but the sun is one of them, right? And so you see this reflection of the order. So yeah, Pharaoh might be the sun or the moon, right? And I might be that one little twinkly star, like off, over to the side, like that's me way off there, that unimportant one, right? That twinkles a little bit. And they could see a lot more stars because they didn't have all the lighting that we have outside. But so that was the idea. The idea, they did have the idea that they were a part, as humans, as Egyptians, they were a part, even if it was a little tiny part, of this cosmic order. Pharaoh obviously was a much bigger part, right? And the gods were bigger parts, but they were some tiny part. They were in the picture, right? They were a piece of the puzzle, sort of in that way. So that's not really thinking of themselves as necessarily divine, but they had a part to play in things that non-Egyptians didn't, in the spiritual realm, as well as their sort of view of themselves materially as creatures. Somebody asked in the chat, what kind of education would Moses have received as the child of Pharaoh's daughter? Well, we're going to read that he was brought up in all the wisdom of the Egyptians. So there you go. The main thing that means is that he would have learned to read, which doesn't sound like much to us, but was a major thing in the ancient world. The literacy rate was infinitesimal in the ancient world. Written languages at this point were not constructed in a way to make literacy possible for most people. You're looking at the revised Mesopotamian cuneiform had 60 or so symbols that you would have to learn. And that's bringing it down. Most of these languages, like hieratic Egyptian, it's hundreds of different symbols for different things that you would have to learn to be literate. So we're going to see some priests in a little while in the book of Exodus, and the type of priests that they are in Egypt is usually translated as lector priests, and that lector is not Hannibal. It's lector as in reader, like lectionary, right? Readings. Yeah, a lector could read. So their whole job, the whole job of this priesthood was to copy and maintain and be able to read what were already ancient documents like the Book of the Dead, right? And these kind of things that preserved ritual practices from ancient times. So they had to preserve those texts and be able to read and interpret and apply those texts. So that would have been that was the mark of education. Moses would have been able to read not only like hieratic Egyptian, but he also would have been able to read cuneiform script, because we know there was a lot of correspondence going on between the Pharaoh and his officials and other cultures in the ancient Near East who were all using versions of cuneiform script for their writing, and probably even some of the very primitive alphabets that were starting to develop. Depending again on exactly when you think this is, that we're on the cusp of the Phoenician alphabet and other alphabets starting to develop. So he may have even had some access to that, but he, at the very least, he would have been able to read just about any document he encountered from any of the major cultures of the Middle East and Egypt. That doesn't include like Linear B and that kind of thing, things from Europe. But in the region, he would have been able to read anything that gave him access to an incredible wealth of knowledge. And of course, Pharaoh and every other king in the ancient Near East maintained libraries. So he very feasibly would have had access to not just all the wisdom of the Egyptians, but pretty much all of the knowledge of various things that had accumulated up to that point in the 2nd millennium BC, somewhere in the middle, wherever you think that exact point was. Yes, Seth.
Hello, is this thing on?
Yeah, is this a question about your namesake, the Egyptian god?
No.
Okay, good.
So I guess it's kind of a quick two-parter. One, if it wasn't pyramids, was it stargates that the Israelites were working on? And then two, and I'm assuming kind of based off of what you said a little bit ago that the answer is no. You mentioned that Egyptians saw themselves as human, and they would have seen the other as sort of like near human animals or manimals, if you will.
Yeah.
So
But they could transform.
They couldn't transform, right? It wasn't quite animorphs. So would that mean then that there was really no escape for an Israelite to sort of assimilate into the local Egyptian culture, and thereby there was no? It seems like Pharaoh is really into the stick and not so much into the carrot. And is that sort of a societal demarcation?
Yeah, they
Okay,
had
so that's a hard and fast line.
Yeah, they had a means to assimilate women.
Right, of course.
Right. They didn't have a means really to assimilate men into their population en masse like that. Even Joseph, right? Even though he was serving in this high-ranking spot, he's still not technically an Egyptian.
Right. Okay.
Right.
So their idea of people is very, very hard and set.
Yes.
Provided for at least half of a population.
Yeah. Yeah.
Thank you.
Because that you could assimilate women because their children are going to be at least half Egyptian. and then the children of those children will be Egyptian. Right. So that in that way, right. But yeah, for men, that's how all the lines were reckoned, right? And all the tribal identities were all reckoned through the men.
Right.
And
So if
that
you can't
presented
beat them,
this-
join them is not a cultural value.
Right. Right. And because they considered them kind of subhuman, it would be like, if I suggested to you, why don't you take this chimp and put human clothes on it and, walk it to kindergarten and make it part of your family as if it were a human. Right. Like that's how they would have viewed bringing a non-Egyptian into, right, a non-Egyptian male into your family.
So would they have been considered sort of an accident of the celestial order?
No,
Like you
they thought that
mentioned
like this is where like Canum comes in, right?
Okay.
So the gods created the Egyptians. They also created all these animals and plants, all these other, right?
Okay, so it's a wide umbrella.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Yeah. And so part of it too, with reproduction, this is occasionally important in the Bible, is they didn't have a concept of male infertility. So if a couple couldn't have children, it was always blamed on the woman, because they basically saw the woman as sort of a receptacle. They saw the woman as like the ground, right? You plant a seed in the ground and it grows, right? But it grows out of the seed. The ground is just there to nurture it and for it to grow in. Right. And so the children sort of belonged to the father for that reason in their thinking. Right. And so you'd say, well, why would they want to have children with someone they didn't consider human? They didn't consider most women to be human, frankly, in the ancient world. That's one of the real, I mean, it doesn't strike us that way now, but that's one of the things that really stands out in the ancient world about Genesis 1 and 2, is that it says women are equally human, right, to men. And it's like, well, duh, but that wasn't a duh in the ancient world. Aristotle, centuries and centuries later, thought that women were basically birth defects, that all babies as they gestated in the womb were sort of trying to become men, and some of them didn't make it and ended up being born as women. So yeah, like what we call misogyny, they would have considered feminism, right? Like they were sort of above and beyond. But yeah, so for that reason, that's part of why they felt they could assimilate women in, because the women they didn't think were doing much of anything anyway. And so it didn't affect their thinking. And the stargates were already ancient, like the pyramids, by this point. To answer the first question. Okay, and this will be the last question, but I'll answer this question from chat about Moses being drawn from the Nile, symbolically a type of baptism. Short answer, yes. Slightly longer answer. That's another place where this connects with, right? Because the go-to place for baptism, like for St. Peter in the New Testament, is the flood, right? But all of this is connected. St. Paul uses the crossing of the Red Sea, right? And Moses in the basket on the Nile is sort of the median point, the pivot point between the story of the flood and the parting of the crossing of the sea, right? And we sort of have foreshadowing of the crossing of the sea, and we have a reflection of the flood here. And so yes, all of those end up being types and understandings of baptism, right? Because Moses himself is saved from destruction by Pharaoh and the evil powers that Pharaoh represents through this basket in the water. The rest of the Israelites are going to be saved from the wrath of Pharaoh by passing through the sea. And then all of that connects to baptism. And Pharaoh here, by the way, just for the record, is the devil, not God. Nobody's being saved from the wrath of God. God was not trying to kill any infants or any Israelites. Pharaoh was. So we will wrap it up there. I don't know if Michael is able to listen right now or not.
Yes, I am, Father.
Okay.
Thank you very much. We will have a change to our Bible study then for next month. It will be on the 4th Tuesday of the month instead of the 3rd Thursday. So we'll be doing it on Tuesday, October 25th, and I'll update that on the calendar and make sure we communicate that in our Antiochian Men newsletter. But thank you again, Father Stephen, very much, and we'll look forward to hearing from you in October for the next Bible study.
All right.
Have a great night. Thank you, guys.
Thank you, everybody.